the little kid who's looking at her shoelaces is looking at blood pouring down a porcelain sink. And I had to go do something about that. And the game was up. I had about 29.
Right.
And I stopped drinking. And then I had to grow up.
This week's guest on Ireland Unfiltered is the brilliant Lisa Dwan. Lisa is currently in Pale Sister at the Gate, a play written for her by Colm Tóibín, who talked about it on a recent episode of Ireland Unfiltered. She is probably the greatest interpreter of Beckett working today. And we talked an awful lot about the theatre and acting and what it means and how it works as a medium for her and how it is a way of establishing truth. But we also talked about her own life, her life from her childhood in Athlone, going away to become a dancer when she was 14, and finding the strength to overcome her problems in life, which it was a really revealing interview with one of the, as I said, one of Ireland's great actors and a fabulous human being. Lisa, welcome to Ireland Unfiltered.
Oh, God, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here.
It's really, really fabulous to see you. We'll talk about what you're doing in Dublin first. Now, you're in Pale Sister in the Gate.
I thought you said you're an impaled sister in the gate. Yeah, that's kind of how it feels.
Is that how it feels today?
Colm Tóibín has written the most extraordinary version of the Antigone myth, told from the point of view of her sister Ismene. And he wrote that for me in Colombia. And we're putting it on in the Gate Theatre. And I'm in day 2 or 3 of rehearsal with the director, Carrie Perloff, under the new administration at the Gate, Selena Cartmel. And it's being co-produced by Audible.
Oh, is it?
And it opens on the 31st.
Okay.
Audible are now producing theatre, which no doubt Joe will be doing.
We might be doing that. It's our next string to our bow. And when you go into that, because this is a show, as you say, that Colm wrote for you. It is you are the cast. It's a one-woman show.
Yeah, I've done a lot of solo shows, and Colm came to see one of those. It was my adaptation of Beckett's prose, Text for Nothing, called Nose Knife, that I adapted at the Old Vic Theatre and brought it to the Abbey. And Colm came to see it and said, I'd like to write you a play. And I said, I need an Antigone because I've never seen a version work. And I had got to that kind of point, where do I go after Beckett? Am I going to keep adapting his prose work, which I had done with Text for Nothing and also Ill Seen, Ill Said, or am I going to wait until I'm 60 when I'm old enough to play Happy Days? Where do I go after that landscape of Beckett's? And I tried lots of things, I did Anna Karenina here, I did Shining City, I did a musical. I tried all sorts of things. And it was interesting, and it had never dawned on me before. I think it was really Beckett that introduced me to my own feminism.
Okay.
By introducing me to myself.
Right.
In that, without character and without narrative, who are we? And to have a landscape as vast as Samuel Beckett's meant that I was quite spoilt for a long period of time.
Okay.
And so things would happen to me and happen to my voice that I didn't know I could produce sounds like that, or have kind of hauntings and yet be in realism the same time. And it just opened up all sorts of doors of possibilities of being
Right.
that we forget about when we're, you know, confronted with the responsibility of our body or our age or our class or our nationality
Yeah.
or our address or our professions, all the things that help life become a little bit more palatable, you know, because it's
Yeah.
quite expansive.
Yeah.
But when you are given a vantage point of something so vast, it does change you. And so when I went back to play these characters, such as Anna and Anna Karenina, or the girlfriend who goes from note to shrill in Shining City, and you know, with the greatest economy of words and lines, these kind of archetypes that are constantly perpetuated in our daily narratives, it made me kind of think, hang on a second, have I been, you know, fed these characters since I've been on the knee and accepted them?
Right.
You know, why am I always playing either the blonde, the bitch, or the psycho?
Yeah.
How many prostitutes are there in my repertoire?
Right.
You know, and even like wonderful playwrights, Florian Zeller puts on the mother in response to his very successful play, The Father, and it's the nurse, the girlfriend, and the mother. And these archetypes of women that are being perpetuated again and again and again made me think about our narratives and what
Right.
we, the responsibility as an actor,
Because when you
perpetuating them.
when you took part in Waking the Feminists, that was what you said, wasn't it? That you were liberated by Beckett from the strippers, the psychos, the bimbos.
And so what to do then with that liberation? What do I do with it? And I thought, and it only really dawned on me when I went to see this amazing speaker, Brian Stevenson, who is a human rights lawyer in America who set up the Equal Justice Initiative and set up a museum on lynching. He said, you know, America needs to confront her narratives or it's just going to keep perpetuating them. You know, she really needs to eyeball her narratives on lynching, on a genocide that took place and, you know, aspects of her darker past. And I thought about that in relation to things that perturb me personally, such as misogyny. And I thought, well, if I was to take that formula, because he said, you know, the North may have won the war, but the South won the narrative.
Right.
And I thought, if we trace back our earliest narratives, the ones that kind of shape me and the world I live in, and I live in the world of kind of modernity and and theatre, well, let's go back to the Greeks.
Okay.
And I think we've started to go back and look at them in a fresh way in recent years. So I've read the Odyssey many times, but it was only when Mary Beard pointed out to me and to all of us in Women in Power that, of course, the Odyssey is a story about Odysseus's voyage home. It's also a story of Telemachus's coming of age.
Right.
And how that is demonstrated in that kind of pivotal moment in the Odyssey is when he silences mother, Penelope, when he says, "Mother, your work is of the lute and the loom, mine is of politics and discourse." And that is the symbol of becoming a man, when you take charge of the woman's tongue and silence the women. And it made me go back to the play that I was most excited about as a teenager and why I wanted to become an actress, which was Antigone.
Okay.
And I performed the Jean Ennui version when I must have been about 18 or 19 in Galway, I thought, I can't make this work. And maybe the reason I couldn't make it work is I wasn't very good actress, and that could still be the case. Or maybe it's written in a way not to work. And so I saved up money, I remember, to go see a production of it in London just to see, was it me? Is there, if a better actor takes this on? Could she make it work? And I remember walking around, is it the Five Dials in Covent Garden that night, utterly dejected and feeling so lost, because she sounded shrill. She sounded that night, despite the actress's gravitas and beautiful voice and presence, like an adolescent whose failure to see the grey and complicated adult world of crayon. And I realised when I started reading the Brecht, where Antigone comes across like a fascist, or in Ireland we had a whole kind of flurry of Irish Antigones in the 80s in response to Conor Cruise O'Brien's description of Antigone as an agent of non-violent violence. That Tom Polan wrote The Riot Act, where he paints her as a Bernadette Devlin character. And then Seamus Heaney slightly sentimentalizes her, and Brendan Kennelly. And I thought, what is it about this woman that she can't just have some rational weight in her voice?
Right.
That these men in particular need to come back and subvert her. So I went back to the original, and it's only with today's idea of quota, gender quota, because it certainly wasn't even apparent to me on first reading this 20 or so years ago, that this famous feminist text still, all the women combined only take up 30% of the actual discourse. And this is supposed to kind of shake the patriarchy. Wow. So I knew there was something to do there. And when Colm said to me, I'd like to write you a play, I said, please, can it be an Antigone? I've never, ever read a version that works, and I think I've read them all. And we brought tons of versions into our course. We taught a course together in Columbia and re-examined this text and came at it from all angles. And we had professors of law. I mean, Columbia was extraordinary in what they afforded us. And I have to say, Colm Tóibín is extraordinary in the time that he took to give to me into this project. And I remember Fintan O'Toole saying to me, Lisa, Colm really listens. And it was just a wonderful privilege to be listened to, that I wasn't put in I'm sure I was, because, but to be considered kind of mad and bad and batty and difficult and tricky and all the kind of usual terms. I mean, this was 2016 when, those labels were being used rather successfully in the American campaign, Nasty Woman, and they work.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it was a source of some amusement until it became a darker reality. I was doing Anna Karenina at the time, but like in the week that Trump was being elected, that taxi drivers in Dublin could tell you with utter conviction how corrupt Hillary Clinton was. And to think that those sort of labels on women are so easily applicable, that they really work. That made me think about the power of narrative. And that there is a propensity that receives these narratives that are either transgenerational or a sort of neurological imprint that those biases live within, that need to be constantly worked against. I mean, there's a lot of study on transgenerational trauma, but maybe transgenerational bias can also, have the same science behind it, which is one of my projects that I'm working on now at MIT. That these neurological pathways that receive these archetypes. And And it made me think about the Greeks and the very first. I remember, I was talking about all of these issues around the waking, the feminist stuff. And my mum said to me, well, Lisa, Rome wasn't built in a day. And I said, Mum, I think Rome might be the fecking problem. And I'm not talking about the Catholic Church here. I'm talking about that classical architecture that's still very much alive in our minds, which is what made me go back to the Greeks.
Right.
And so, we think about the young girl speaking truth to power, challenging the patriarchy. We'll look at, the Irish Times did a brilliant article recently about how Greta Thunberg frightens men. That it is met
still
with a
happening.
backlash, and it's still happening. And that's really striking. Or a certain, presenter in Ireland recently made some comment about her needing to go home and play or something. I can't remember. But the fact that propensity is there to dismiss and to silence and the threat of that confident female challenging voice, in the same way that the propensity for the immigrant mother creates a kind of fear in society. Well, that's what Medea is, or the need to cut off Medusa's head and the fear of her intelligence and wit, or the untrustworthiness, the moral, let's say, shadiness and disloyalty around the idea of a beautiful woman, Helen of Troy. I really feel that...
So these are handed down.
Yeah, and we don't even
generations.
think about them. And yet we have inherited those biases. So the architecture is still very much alive, at least in our minds on some level. And so I don't know what else to do. I'm not a great believer in vigilantism. I'm not a great believer in hashtags. Okay, I'm not a big kind of joiner.
Right.
So I just didn't know what to do. And as an artist, I thought, well, maybe I could go back here and just put a bit of flesh on this, on the remnants of this legacy.
And that's what you've done with this play.
Well, that's what I'm trying to do. And Colm and I worked very, very hard on the piece, and we had tremendous fertile time. And I have to say, it really filled me with a lot of hope. By no means did I win at any point, and God, we really kind of met in the middle. But we had a lot of conversations about the seminal central argument about, as Rudolf Steiner says, Antigones are being imagined and reimagined for thousands of years with the implicit message, Antigone, lie down. And, I had young 18-year-old students coming in, with their little scattering of Hegel. And they were fully, confident in their argument that the weight was very much in Crayen's camp about the sanity of the argument versus Antigone's irrationality and insanity. And I just couldn't get over how a young 18-year-old boy came in with that kind of pre-prepared package. And my job was to disseminate that, examine it, and see if I could prise that open a little bit.
Right.
And make that more difficult conclusion to arrive to. Complicated.
It is. It's a lifetime's work.
Well, I don't know. Maybe it's extremely arrogant of me to even try, but I don't know what else to do.
Why would it be arrogant to even try? Like, it seems when you put it like that it's necessary.
It's very worthy, though. I mean, in between, I play a drug dealer in Netflix.
Right,
just for,
So, yeah. Well, that's good, just to relax. Just to unwind. You're in Top Boy. How do you find that? Because you said to me you were filming Top Boy and then flying off to Colombia to teach.
I know Netflix were very good on the whole. They gave me Mondays off.
Right.
So I would get on a flight to New York either Saturday morning after filming on Friday night or Sunday, and write my lecture and give a class in Colombia on Monday morning, and then get on a plane that night and be on set for Tuesday.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what is, what is the different dynamic between working on something like that and working in the theatre, especially the theatre that you do on your own?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I suppose teaching is a certain. Most teachers listening or watching would recognize that it is a bit of a theatre, a classroom, and reading your audience, and reading the room, and trying to engage and also listen. But it's just a wonderful balance that I've managed to strike, mostly because I needed to pay my mortgage, to be perfectly frank, but a balance that I've been able to engage that part of my brain.
Right. And then, but when is there a difference then when you're jumping from that to doing Top Boy? Like, what is that? Like, what different parts of your brain and
it's hilarious. I'm a nerd, and so I didn't know half of these guys were like very, very, very famous rappers.
Right.
And I didn't know Drake's music.
Yeah.
And I had to admit to Dave, I was, he's number one in England at the moment, and he's only 21 or something crazy. He's so talented. But I had to admit that, look, I'm a little behind. I've been a bit busy. Catch me up. What's been happening since Suzanne Vega? He's like, who? Or, I was stopped at the airport the other day, and I was kind of singing away to myself with my earpods in, and someone, recognized me from the show, and they said, do you mind me asking what you're listening to? And I went, it's Yentl. They didn't even know what that was. And I mean, I'm so embarrassed, but I've always been a bit of a nerd. And, so the guys made a playlist for me of, is it drill, brill, or grill music? Drill, I think drill, which is another brand of grime.
Yeah.
It's more recent and a lot more gang related and crime related, and some of the language, quite frankly, is kind of frighteningly very cool. Definitely very cool and very just. I now I listen to it all the time working out, but quite disturbingly misogynistic.
Yeah.
And so I'm listening to it in makeup, and I won't repeat it because it's pretty, unrepeatable. Maybe on JOE.ie. I don't know how woke you guys are, but how she legs it up the ass or something. I mean, it's like at 7:30 in the morning. And I'm going, oh, God, this is great, guys. And then I'm getting on a plane to go and teach in the Women and Gender Studies Department in Colombia about feminism. So it was quite an interesting mix that I was holding somewhere above Greenland, as I would it would dawn on me the kind of world I was living in, somewhere above Labrador. It's always seemed, when I come to on an airplane, I always seem to be hovering above some place called Labrador. But it's quite a heady mix, but I feel grateful for it, and in the same way, I'm doing a very kind of what might seem solitary work these one woman plays.
When you say you're not a joiner, like, is that something that extends to some of that you have done so much stuff on your own? Is it tempting to do that, to be solitary and to be isolated to an extent? Although I know it's theatre and you're not just there on your own.
I don't know what's the cause and what's the effect. Is it genetic? Is it a self-pitying kind of mopiness that means I go off on my own and do stuff, or what? But I remember someone on stage recently, I was doing an event, and we were talking about all these heady heights of what I was trying to do. And I think, to be fair, his intention was to bring me down a peg or two by just interjecting at the end that you strike me as quite a lonely person, are you? And in that moment, the whole audience went, oh, and it was a disappointing question following what I was talking about.
Yeah.
But I didn't turn on him. I just said, one of the things about licking the ground of loneliness, which I have done, and I don't say that lightly, but when you do Samuel Beckett's work, eyeballing some of the kind of really difficult aspects of life and reality and humanity, and you travel the world, which I did with the Becketts for years on my own. Every time waking up in a new place on the wrong time zone to call someone who might care, and eyeballing the deepest, darkest aspects of humanity and human frailty, confronting our own impending death, which we're all just a breath away from, but we so rarely talk about or face. I remember someone said to me, Beckett's a very cruel writer. It might be okay for him to describe the world in this way, but the rest of us need our delusions. And she's right. Beckett in particular gets us to confront these things. And I did go to those depths of loneliness and often very much was in quite frightening and fragile psychological states as a result. But it did liberate me from the fear of loneliness, because I think I licked the bottom of my own loneliness. And it meant that I wasn't making decisions based on fear of loneliness. And so I was kind of liberated from the fears, and I found an extraordinary amount of discovery and joy in those places too. And
this is when you were, whilst you've been working on doing Beckett.
Yeah. I mean, I was your typical lonely kid. I was always a bit odd.
Yeah.
And as a result of being odd, I was badly bullied. And that just makes you lonelier. Yeah. And I was that kid who didn't have anyone to have lunch with. And so I would just walk. My lunch times were walking.
Right.
And I have very strong memories of my lunch times as a kid, looking down at my shoes. And occasionally the shoelaces becoming blurred as I would be kind of dumbfounded by my own sadness at being so isolated. And often, and for many years, I became a kind of workaholic and would just keep walking in order to stop feeling that sense of loneliness. And the Beckett made me confront a lot of that.
Right.
And I felt ultimately that was very liberating. And I think I've just accepted that's part of my condition at times.
Yeah.
And I don't have to make knee-jerk decisions like marry some poor unfortunate victim or or reach for something that would dumb it down or anesthetize myself in some way, which in the past I probably did. And I think a huge, as uncomfortable as those moments can be, often some sort of profundity arrives underneath that. An awareness that you're not alone, or an awareness of something very beautiful, or your own natural propensity for being tickled by beauty or love or joy.
Is the truth of it a sort of a balm as well sometimes? The fact that when you explore something like Beckett, the fact that it is exploring loneliness and all, as you say, like, I think it strikes me when somebody says to you, you seem like a very lonely person. That's said from a position of kind of a lack of self-knowledge too, because it's like we are, as you say, we're all alone.
I know.
And it's it's like when people say, only boring people get bored or something like this.
Yeah.
Like we all get bored.
Yeah.
We all get we are all alone.
Yeah.
But just when you have something like Beckett and it gives you a truth, is that in any way, is that something that actually acts as as a protection and a prophylactic, if you like, against the scariness of it, or the fear of it.
I really believe it is. And a kind of timbre can enter into your tone and your work and your voice that has a kind of gravitas that I certainly didn't have in my life before that. And I recognized then that truth also has a sound.
Yeah.
And Beckett introduced me to that.
Right.
And I listen for it and I recognize it in others. And often you know that it comes at a cost.
Yeah.
And you're very grateful to the person or individual or the thing that is prepared to pay that cost or count that cost and give an offering. And I also learned from Beckett, and I think I'm very, 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 very privileged because not an awful lot of people get an opportunity to do this. I get an opportunity in my craft to turn my wounds into offerings, into work, and transform them as gifts. An awful lot of people don't get to do that. They just get to suffer in silence. And their stoicism is never celebrated or, or they don't.
And that sense of being, a lot of guests we've had on this show, had that same experience of being an outsider, feeling like an outsider as a kid. And, and it's not, I would have felt that. Lots of people would feel that sense. And it's what people who sat in that chair have said how it was such an agony when they were a kid, but then when you become an artist or whatever, it becomes something that you can make meaning out of it.
Yeah, I'd love to say that you can grow that up. I'd love to tell you that, but I can tell you right now, there's still the little kid. Who, I can just touch her. That kid who's, it's that close to me. That's always available. That vulnerability and that feeling of utter isolation. I have it, I'm here talking with you. I'm doing a very interesting project, but she's not far. And I'd love to tell you that it is possible with success or anything to grow it up, but it isn't.
No.
And I think that's something that you also have to pay homage to.
Right.
You can develop new neurological pathways. You can develop new narratives, but the propensity to regress, if you will, or stay the same is always there. And I think that's something to recognize society is capable of too. You just have to think about a country like Turkey. Years ago, it was the bastion for, multiculturalism and this wonderful meeting point of East meets West and how progressive it was and extraordinary. And now you go back and there is the current administration and intellectuals are being imprisoned and writers, are being targeted and blacklisted. And the veil is creeping in. Or you look at, the laws on child marriage and how they're being extended in favor of young pedophiles. And or you hear only a couple of days ago the death of an 8-year-old child from her internal injuries on her wedding night. And you think about progress. We have someone who has got the strongest position of power in the world now, who some little 8-year-old kid is going to look up and say, "Mom, if I talk about grabbing a woman by the pussy, will I, or we can do whatever we want with them? Will I too be president one day?" I mean, is this the agenda that we're setting? This is, on the one hand, we're so connected with this. Look what's happening here. What a multi-tech world. JOE.ie is but that we're capable of such barbaric language and behavior and celebrate it.
I want to ask you a bit about that. And when you talk about narratives of a country and you talk about America, and you've lived in London, I know you're back and forth in New York a lot, but we met first in London years ago.
Did.
And London, we had Reginald D. Hunter on this show a couple of weeks ago, and he said that London is a city of outsiders.
Yep.
And somebody has described to me as a city of people, who are sort of lost tribes people. It's sort of that sense of people, just transient people to a degree, which is what I loved about it when I lived there.
Yeah.
When I hear you talk now, when I see what you said about Ireland, I imagine that was something perhaps you found energizing about it too. How do you feel it is now? And I know England and London are probably more in conflict than they've ever been. But how do you feel about living there with Brexit happening, with that sense of a narrative, an old narrative being stitched onto a country?
Yeah. I was very lucky. I grew up in a household, and maybe it was because it was, and maybe you're the same. I don't know. Maybe most of your viewers or listeners are the same, but in the wake of a civil war, which Ireland was, and it was brother against brother, we weren't really allowed to talk about it. We weren't really allowed to talk about the IRA or, it was just, we were steered towards Europe, aggressively towards Europe, towards a bigger idea of ourselves. That's what Europe meant for us growing up. And I just remember our house, was dotted with Miriam Makeba, the ANC. Our house was called Shalom, and we had Yentl. I mean, we had Spanish dancers on the wall. I saw you said you knew the ANC national anthem by the age of 12, I heard you say. Yeah. And we were just brought up to celebrate multiculturalism. Whether it's true or not, there was always talks about the Dwans, Spanish blood or Latin blood, or whatever the hell we had. I don't know what we had. But, the Odyssey and the Greeks played a big role in our lives growing up, in our imaginations. And my sister went to United World College. My brother went to United World College. They would give our address to their college mates who'd rock up. And if there wasn't room in the house, there'd be people camping out the front garden and the back garden. I'm not saying it was some sort of Waltons, that it wasn't, nor was it John McGahern. It was, it was a mixed bag. But the one blessing I will have is that we were always steered towards a broader narrative in reaction to a narrowing that had happened.
A nationalism.
So we were brought up in fear of nationalism. And I have to say, when I moved to London, I remember lying on my bed in this flat above House of Mystery Chemist in Southend Green and turning on Radio 4, and I could not believe that this was free. I couldn't believe that national discourse at such a high nuanced level with things like the Wreath lectures was free. I couldn't believe the NHS was free. I couldn't believe walking out to the park that, there was, falafel stalls and, the Indian food was almost like a national dish. That was just so much tolerance and multiculturalism. And I remember the first summer I went to London, I think it was 2001, it just felt so vibrant and exciting and liberal and nuanced and accepting. And I just felt so proud to live in this inclusive city. And they taught me how to behave. They taught me what to say and what not to say, what was polite and what wasn't, what was inappropriate was, and I've never felt curtailed by political correctness. And then all of a sudden, at some point, that became a dirty word, and it became a harness for certain people's biases when they felt they'd been pushed too far. And maybe one of the problems with liberalism is that we didn't see that people were being pushed at the seams of what they could tolerate or not. I don't know. I don't know if it's helpful for us to think about that. But I didn't see it coming apart at the seams. I didn't see the angry tone until it was too late. I couldn't understand what was Nigel Farage's problem. I didn't understand, and still don't, the lies that they peddled and the fears that they were scratching. But the fear of the outsider and the fear of the immigrant mother. And, now looking back, we start to see that they were picking at something quite old.
Yeah.
Now, to tell you that story isn't entirely true as an Irish person. We'd hear it occasionally. We thought we'd belonged. And there would be the occasional stark reminder that we didn't.
Yeah.
There would be the paddywhackery. There'd be the kind of jocular racism, that would sneak in occasionally, or you'd just be reminded that you weren't of the fold in certain environments because you didn't go to those schools. You didn't have the kind of, you weren't part of the establishment, and that when you tick a certain kind of form or box, you are ticking white Irish, you are ticking other next to Asian and black, and you were fulfilling a certain kind of quota, and to say that wasn't there just isn't simply truthful. But I can't get over, given how far Britain had gone in terms of its tolerance and what a success story it was, how it could have regressed to the way that it did without it picking on an old narrative that was pre-prepared. And we go back to those kind of biases. So at this point, and I've met the Johnsons, and I know them as a family, and I know that they are a bunch of people who've never tasted consequence. They don't know what it is to have a hard consequence. They don't know what it is not to have a social safety net underneath them. They don't know what that feels like. So,
and do you think when you say you met them, how did that manifest itself? Do you see there's a kind of this is a game?
Yeah, I think that if you don't know what consequences are, you know, everything's just a bit of a joke.
Yeah.
Everything is a bit of a game, because you're never going to have to face the harsh realities of some of your decision makings, and I happened to bump into Joe Johnson on the night that he resigned, and he was at a party, and I thought, gosh, if you're going to make such a kind of almost weighty Greek stance against your family in favor of the government, would you go out to party?
Right.
That what you do? And I watched him, I was watching him all night, and he was smiling and laughing, and I know his sister, and and I've met the father, and I've met Boris, and I just don't feel the weight and gravitas of their situation, and
you don't feel it?
I don't believe it.
You're right.
I don't believe that they feel that, God, if I put a foot wrong here, this, there just seems to be a cushioning around them, which there is.
Yeah.
And then I get an opportunity to do Top Boy and work with artists and young people from a community that I didn't come from. And it was very funny. On the very first read-through, Drake was there and all of these people, and then we had a little gathering somewhere in Bloomsbury, and it was right next to the London Review of Books, and there was Colm next door. Okay. And I'm out with all my cast.
And Drake.
And they're all drinking champagne. We've just had our read-through, and in the bookshop is Colm doing a reading for Ruth Padell and her book.
Okay.
And I popped inside, and you had one group of people that were entirely black. And then there wasn't a single black person in the London Review bookstore. But I went in and I spoke to everybody and had a laugh, and I came back out. And my co-star, Michael Ward, said to me, you see, you can walk in there and live in that world and then come out here. I can't live in both those worlds. I can't go in there. And I thought he's right.
Yeah.
And for a moment, I was arrogant enough to say, it's the world of books. You can just open up a book. It's free to everybody. The truth is, it really isn't. When your mind and your life has been steered in a way, it takes so much freedom, financial freedom, time, imaginative freedom.
Yeah.
And in order to have that kind of freedom, you need to have a sense of possibility. And if that isn't open and available to you and constantly prized open, that you can have this, or this can be yours, or you can walk into this world, and if that isn't constantly being encouraged, that it's just as much yours as it is mine, then it's arrogant and downright wrong of me to presume that it is. Having said that, the Top Boy program and my experience working with these guys has exposed me to the most extraordinary bunch of artists, and talk about a community that helps one another. Right. You know, they're so encouraging, Stormzy to Dave to Little Sims to sharing platforms with one another. They're so generous as a community of artists to each other, helping each other on certain platforms and shout outs. And, you know, it's really collaborative and vibrant, and is such a confident voice coming from a Britain that we haven't heard as much of before, and is just as British as the Johnsons. In fact, more so, because it's based more in reality. It's more hard-earned. It's more reflective of the vast majority of people. And it's a world of real consequences. And you know what? Real talent. And real hope. And real intelligence, and, you know, real creativity, because by God have they had to be creative when traditional doors just aren't open. So how are they going to build an audience? How are they going to be heard? They're going to be extremely precise and driven in what they want to say. And it's an articulate, confident, creative world that I feel extremely privileged to be part of. You know, I've learned so much from these artists just working on set with them about what truth is and what reality is. And they're teaching me so much as an actress. And it's been a real eye-opener. I feel very proud to be allowed to be part of this community. And they really have allowed me to be, you know.
Explain to me then, you talked about the house you grew up in and what it was like. How did you feel then at the age of 14 when you went to Leeds to become a dancer? What were your emotions leaving that type of home?
I gave you one snapshot of a home. There were others.
Yeah.
And
you were the youngest.
I was the youngest, and they were all gone. And I was this weird kid who had danced with Nureyev, who did ballet, who
in Athlone.
Yeah, who read, you know, as pretentious as it sounds, Joyce or Austen behind my maths book. You know, who lived in as actually direct quote from my school report, lives in a fantasy world. Lisa has severe behavioural difficulties. Lisa Dwan lives in a fantasy world. I used to just crave getting out of Athlone. I don't know what I thought would be beyond it, but I wasn't exactly a happy child. I don't think you might describe me as a happy child. I had a great appetite for the world, and I do think, and I still do, a great appreciation for beauty, and I can find beauty in very kind of ordinary things, and so I felt extremely privileged to be able to be in a dance studio and inhabiting the bars of some beautiful classical music while overlooking the moors. I was exposed to other dancers and voices and extraordinary artists and extraordinary women. I was just thinking this morning, this wonderful dancer, Sandra from Portugal, who introduced me to Gabriel Garcia Marquez and Silvio Rodriguez and the Cuban singer and our Cuban singer and just a whole kind of world out there. I was very pretentious, but I just had such an appetite for. There was a bookstore in Halifax where I'd go shopping and get all these secondhand bookstores, and I remember carrying around Nietzsche and philosophizing with a hammer and Kundera, and I couldn't believe that was available to me, and that I was getting a chance to work. I remember there was this amazing dance teacher in ballet school. Her name was Josie Corrick. She died, but in that an hour and a half, she would create from scratch a new dance piece, a new work every day. She never talked in her class. And she always had a cigarette dangling from her mouth. And we'd follow her. So dance was a complete language. So she didn't need to illustrate by punctuating what we were doing with vocabulary. We just followed her. And each class she would create a new work. And the woman was a genius. And just the privilege of being part of that. I have to say, I've been extremely lucky in my life to be around artists, these women who would create the most extraordinary things. Like even when I was in Athlone, I had a horse riding teacher from Australia, this woman called JOE.ie, who set up the pony club in Athlone. And even though our ponies were probably better off in a glue factory, I learned how to do dressage on a Clydesdale who should have been retired about 10 years previously. But we didn't know that. We plaited those horses' tails and manes and had such pride. And even though it was my brother's tie and my sister's jumper, that was, it was immaculate. And just the level of pride that we took to those things, or when I danced in Coppelia or the Nutcracker when I was a kid, all the mum sewing costumes that were modelled from watching VHSs of the Royal Ballet, but we didn't know that, that I was wearing my teacher's tights on my head, just the imaginative freedom that I got from these extraordinary women, these women who held the lamp out in front of me, and my memory of those times as at times troubling, at times lonely, at times frightening, and I was 14 and living alone and very vulnerable. I also had these extraordinary moments of beauty that I fertilize more than I do the darker times.
And you wanted to be a dancer, that was what you want, and then you got an injury.
My knees were not going to hack it. I was dancing with the London Lewis Ballet Company, and I was seeing the Leeds United physiotherapist, this guy called Alan Sutton, and I had no cartilage, and I was in a lot of pain a lot of the time, and a decision was going to have to be made. And I returned to Ireland, and I got extremely depressed for a little while, until I found my way into acting.
And you found acting in Ireland tricky, though. You said, that there was more of a closed shop, was it? It was something that...
Well, initially it wasn't. Initially I didn't know what. to think about it. I started in Galway and people were very kind to me there. There was the Galway Youth Theatre and there was a fabulous teacher called Max Halfer. I remember walking past Charlie Byrne's bookstore and there was The Actor Speaks by Patsy Rodenberg. I think it was $3.50 at the time. I have it at home. It's a black cover. And I took that home to this little bedsit flat thing I was living in with black plastic bags over the windows and and my fan heater and my £1 sausage roll a day in order for me to be able to keep smoking. And I know I'm painting this as, Angela's ashes. It was deeply happy, creative time, I might add, all by my own choice. Had I done what my parents told me, my life could have been very different, but I didn't. And I imagine, God, wouldn't it be amazing to be an actress? And I was learning all about the RSC and the OVIC and these amazing establishments and Joan Plowright and all these fabulous kind of emblems of British theatre were coming into my imagination and my vision. And, I think about that. And for anyone young listening, I do think you can kind of manifest things maybe because, a couple of years ago, I'm in the Old Vic Theatre doing a one-woman play from my own adaptation of Beckett's work, and Matthew Warchus and the wonderful Georgia Gatti said, we think you might need some vocal help. Why don't we bring someone in for a session or two? And I said, great, that would be wonderful. It's 1,000-seater and just one little voice has to hit the back of the room. And in walks Patsy Rosenberg.
Right.
And she put her hands on my diaphragm and on my stomach and she said, it all comes from here. And got me to drop my voice right down into my womb. And I still feel her hands on, on my womb when I go out on stage and I'm at my most nervous. I summon these wonderful women, these guides that I've been lucky enough to be surrounded by all along. And I found that time in Galway was such a rich and fertile ground for everything that came afterwards. And even though certain doors closed for me, in a way, looking back, I'm extremely grateful they did.
But talk to me then about, like you talked about stage fright you experienced, the anxiety you had in your 20s. Talk to me about that and how you manage, as you say. I imagine, and I don't imagine, because I know I've suffered from anxiety myself. I know what it's like, and it is, when you talk about the little child that's still there. The thing about anxiety, from my viewpoint with anxiety, again, one of the things that for a long time I was trying to make it go away, and then I realized that actually the way I was going to live with it would be
to lean in.
It would be, and it would be a companion, but you would just kind of be aware of it there, and you couldn't make it go away. How long did you try and make it go away for?
A long time. I think I was very rudderless. Like I didn't really, and it's not their fault, but I didn't really have any parents, that wasn't available to me. And
what do you mean by that?
Well, I left home so young, and it wasn't just the way the cards fell. It wasn't available to me. And as a result of dropping out of school and also being just this weird kid, I didn't have peers. So I didn't have really anyone who was living a similar life to me. And I was living alone at 15, 16, 17, And I was a pretty kid who was pretty vulnerable. And without going into that dark past, you can imagine everything that could have happened to a vulnerable kid happened, you know, and so there were kind of traumas that were certainly not addressed, and I didn't have the vocabulary for it. Like, we have all sorts of hashtags and vocabulary now to explain very difficult traumatic events. But in those days, and that kind of Ireland, and that kind of shame, and that, we just didn't have it, you know, and it just wasn't available. And I didn't have any other coping mechanisms other than I recognized that when I drank, nothing bothered me as much. And kind of worked for a moment, and it became a fantastic vehicle. And for a brief moment, I wasn't so threatening to other girls, or, you know, because I could get nice and messy, and then they could kind of laugh at me or carry me home or throw me over the hedge. Or you know, I mean.
But you could feel for that moment you fitted in.
Yeah, because I was kind of manageable. And then I seemed to have, you know, a profound talent for it. You know, I had hollow legs, and all of a sudden this little emaciated dancer could drink most men under the table. Check me out. You know, finally I found a talent.
Right.
And then I stopped needing to feel anything, because then if I woke up and I had that kind of nervous feeling and I had to go do an interview or something, I could just have a little drink, you know, or if I have to go out on, you know, and pretty much I needed it more or less around the clock.
Right. To medicate yourself.
To medicate against that isolation and loneliness. And then the little kid who looks at her shoelaces becoming more and more blurred, you know, didn't emerge.
Right. But if she's still there, you're not doing anything she's still there.
Oh, then the little kid who's looking at her shoelaces is looking at blood pouring down a porcelain sink. And I had to go do something about that. And the game was up. I had about 29.
Right.
And I stopped drinking. And then I had to grow up.
Is that what it was?
I think I'd stopped growing from the moment I discovered that you could take something to anesthetize those feelings of, I mean, I'm simplifying a much more complicated, difficult journey, and also a wonderful one. You know, I couldn't recommend it more, but it's bumpy.
But is it bumpy because it's back to that thing of the truth. It is actually closer to the truth.
It is the truth, and it's hard. You know, and I am a tricky character. You know, I recognize that I'm hypersensitive. I'm like somebody who doesn't have skin. I feel everything. And there are a lot of neurological pathways. That doesn't make me more intelligent. It just makes me very heightened. And that's a lot to manage on a daily basis.
Without medication.
Without medication. And sometimes it's a lot to hold, and a lot to, you know, it's not always pleasant in here, you know. Now, on the other hand, having all of those senses available to me makes me kind of good at what I do. You know, but it needs to be managed and looked after, and I can't take it too much for granted. And it means that I have to become at peace with certain aspects of my hypersensitivity and my weirdness, and where I can go and where I can't go, and where's safe and where isn't, and what kind of work I can do and maybe what I can't, and you know, and recognize that I'm not a picnic to be around for others.
And what do you do when you're not a picnic to be around?
It's hard, you know. I try and make amends.
Yeah.
I try and keep a certain amount of my side of the street clean as much as I possibly can. You know, I try and meditate and look after myself and keep fit and keep spiritually fit and just try, you know, and start again, you know, and be humble enough to recognize that it's not easy.
Yeah. But it's worth it because of everything.
Who knows? I mean,
but it's not as you say, it's not the blood on the porcelain sink anyway, is it?
No, I would be dead
if
I kept going the way I was, and I certainly wouldn't have been able to have a career at all.
Could you have done what you're doing, what you've done?
No, not for a second.
Would you be?
In fact, I didn't even know. I mean, I was the kid who dropped out of school at 14, and somehow, because I did go down the bumpy road of trying to find the truth, my own truth. Yeah. I mean, this is just my little camp in the world. It is not for everybody, you know, and a lot of people probably don't like the work I do or what I have to say about the world, or, you know, might be unpalatable, but it's just my particular, but there's no way I could have even have set up camp. There's no way I could have stood in my own shoes. In fact, there's no way I could have even have stood upright. But it has meant that sometimes I have commanded many audiences of thousands of people and gained reviews I could only have dreamt of, and toured the world, a world that I would talk about in bars but couldn't even have the confidence to get on a plane, you know, that it has opened up all sorts of possibilities to me, that the little kid who dropped out of school at 14 is now a professor in universities or teaches in Princeton and Columbia and MIT and Oxford and Cambridge and École Normale Supérieure, and had work published, and that I've been able to kind of grapple and talk with things that minds like Samuel Beckett and so have attempted to, and Dante and Virgil and been able to be a participant in these discussions about humanity and loneliness and isolation and the other and the whole it of it all, that I've been able to participate in art surrounding the it of it all by being brave enough or having the courage not to pick up a drink and to be able to stand in my own shoes, as uncomfortable sometimes as they are. Means that I've been able to lift up my head and eyeball the it of it all.
Lisa, you're an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I didn't expect to go where we went, but here we are. Thank you so
wonderful.
much.
Thank you. Well, that was a phenomenal interview. It was a privilege to listen to Lisa today. Before we go, don't forget to subscribe to Ireland Unfiltered on all the usual channels, and if you like this show, please leave a review.